The Nexus Prime Military Academy had seen better days, though considering it was built to accommodate 17 different species, with wildly incompatible physiologies, better was a relative term. The architects had clearly given up somewhere around species 12, judging by the bizarre mismatch of environmental controls that left half the corridors sweltering while the other half could freeze a glacian's appendages clean off. Today's fresh batch of recruits milled about the orientation hall like a xenobiologist's fever dream. Towering Zenthari warriors cast shadows that could eclipse small moons, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lighting that someone had insisted would work for most species. Brutox soldiers clanked around in their natural armor plating, each footstep reverberating through the reinforced flooring like a small earthquake. The Varnari contingent had claimed the upper reaches of the hall, their 6 arms gesticulating wildly as they discussed battle tactics in their rapid-fire clicking language. And then there was the human. She stood roughly 5'0" in her regulation boots, which the quartermaster had reluctantly special ordered, because apparently the Galactic Defense Coalition hadn't anticipated recruiting someone who could shop in the children's section. Her uniform hung loose in places where other species boasted impressive musculature, and her pale complexion looked positively anemic next to the vibrant scales, carapaces, and fur of her fellow recruits. The other species had noticed her, naturally. How could they not? She was like a minnow that had somehow wandered into a shark tank. Except the sharks were confused about what to do with something so obviously out of place. A few Brutox had actually checked their data pads to confirm that yes, this was indeed supposed to be a military academy and not a daycare facility. "Attention, maggots," the voice boomed across the hall with the subtle grace of a plasma cannon discharge. Drill Sergeant Groktar emerged from the shadows like a nightmare that had been hitting the gym. The Brutox officer stood 9 feet of pure intimidation, his natural armor scarred from actual combat rather than the ceremonial scratches some officers sport. His forearms ended in claws that could probably open standard military rations without a can opener, and his eyes held the kind of cold calculation that suggested he'd counted his kills and kept the receipts. The hall fell silent, which was impressive considering it contained species that communicated through subsonic rumbles, ultrasonic squeaks, and what could generously be called interpretive screeching. "Welcome to Nexus Prime, where we separate the predators from the prey," Groktar announced, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone describing a root canal. "Look around you. Some of you are obviously warrior material." His gaze swept appreciatively over the Zenthari, whose mandibles clicked in acknowledgement. "Some of you are clearly built for battle." The Brutox contingent straightened their already impressive postures, then his eyes found the human. "And some of..." He paused, tilting his massive head as if trying to solve a particularly puzzling equation. "Some of you make me question whether our recruitment standards have dropped lower than a Galvani's self-esteem after molting season." A few snickers rippled through the crowd. The human remained perfectly still, her expression neutral in that particularly human way that could mean anything from mild boredom to homicidal plan. "The Galactic Defense Coalition has spent considerable resources training warriors from across the galaxy," Groktar continued, beginning his traditional intimidation patrol around the room. Each footstep sounded like a small demolition project. "We've refined combat techniques from 1,000 worlds. We've studied the art of war as practiced by species who were conquering star systems while your ancestors were still figuring out fire." He stopped directly in front of the human, forcing her to crane her neck at an angle that would give a chiropractor nightmares just to maintain eye contact. "But apparently we've also decided to experiment with recruiting, whatever this is supposed to be." He gestured at her with one massive claw, as if she were an exhibit in a museum of military curiosities. "Tell me, recruit, what exactly makes you think you belong among warriors?" The human looked up at him with those peculiarly bright eyes that seemed far too alert for something so small and fragile. "Permission to speak freely, Sergeant. By all means, enlighten us with your wisdom. I was told this was a military academy, not a zoo exhibition. If you're looking for impressive displays of natural weaponry, might I suggest the xenobiology department down the hall?" The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either laughter or violence. Several Zenthari mandibles stopped clicking entirely, while a few Brutox exchanged glances that suggested they weren't sure whether to be impressed or appalled by the audacity. Groktar's expression shifted through several phases of disbelief before settling on something that resembled predatory amusement. It speaks, and with such confidence." He leaned down until his scarred face was level with hers, his breath carrying the charming aroma of something that had died recently, and not peacefully. Confidence is admirable, recruit. Misplaced confidence is hilarious. I'll make a note of that for my comedy routine, Sergeant. The drill sergeant straightened to his full, terrifying height, a slow grin spreading across his features that revealed teeth designed for things more unpleasant than conversation. I do believe we have ourselves a volunteer for tomorrow's combat demonstration. Around the hall, various species suddenly found the ceiling architecture fascinating, the floor patterns mesmerizing, or their own appendages worthy of intense scrutiny. Nobody wanted to be standing too close when the inevitable happened. Dismissed, Groktar roared, though his eyes never left the human. Rest well tonight, recruits. Tomorrow we separate theory from practice, bravado from capability, and apparently consciousness from some poor fool who doesn't know when to keep her mouth shut. As the crowd dispersed with the enthusiasm of witnesses fleeing a crime scene, the human remained where she stood for a moment longer, studying the drill sergeant with the same detached interest a scientist might show a particularly virulent bacteria sample. Then she smiled, just a small upturn at the corners of her mouth that somehow managed to suggest she knew something the rest of them didn't. Groktar watched her walk away, her small form disappearing into the crowd of giants, and felt the first stirring of something that might have been unease. In his extensive experience, prey animals that smiled usually had very good reasons for their confidence. Of course, they usually ended up being wrong about those reasons. Usually, dawn on Nexus Prime arrived with all the subtlety of a supernova, thanks to the binary star system that some cosmic comedian had decided would make an excellent location for a military academy. The training grounds sprawled across several hectares of reinforced diorite, dotted with obstacle courses that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a doctorate in creative sadism. The morning air carried the distinctive scent of ozone from the energy barriers, mixed with the less pleasant aroma of various alien species engaged in vigorous physical activity. It was the kind of smell that made recruitment brochures stick to euphemisms like challenging environment and character building. Drill Sergeant Groktar surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of a predator who'd spent the night sharpening his claws. Around the perimeter of the main combat ring, yesterday's fresh recruits had assembled with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The Zenthari maintained their typical stoic composure, though their compound eyes tracked every movement with predatory focus. The Brutox contingent had formed their own cluster, their natural armor gleaming in the morning light like a collection of walking tanks. And there, standing somewhat apart from the crowd, was the human. She'd arrived early, Groktar noted with grudging professional respect. That showed either admirable dedication or a death wish so profound it bordered on philosophy. She stood quietly observing the other recruits with that same unsettling calm she'd displayed yesterday, as if she were watching a mildly interesting documentary rather than preparing for what would likely be her own systematic dismantling. Gather round, future disappointment. Groktar's voice carried across the training ground with the warm charm of grinding metal. Today we begin your education in the fine art of not dying horribly in combat. Some of you will learn quickly, others will provide valuable lessons in what not to do. The recruits formed a loose semicircle around the combat ring, a raised platform equipped with energy shields designed to contain the violence within while allowing spectators to observe the carnage in relative safety. It was a thoughtful design feature that had saved the Academy considerable cleanup costs over the years. Combat, Groktar began, pacing around the ring's perimeter like a caged predator, is the ultimate test of a warrior's worth. Speed, strength, tactics, instinct, everything you are gets distilled down to a few crucial moments, where the universe decides whether you're predator or prey. He gestured toward a towering Zenthari warrior whose chitinous exoskeleton bore the ritual scarification of his homeworld's military tradition. Trooper Hexcree, demonstrate proper combat stance. The warrior moved with liquid grace, his forearms positioning themselves in a configuration that spoke of thousands of years of evolutionary refinement. His mandibles clicked appreciatively as he shifted through a series of attack positions that would have impressed a philosophy major studying the aesthetics of violence. Notice the natural weapons. Groktar continued his lecture. The reinforced exoskeleton, the redundant limb configuration. This is what millions of years of evolution produces when a species takes warfare seriously. Next came a demonstration from one of the Brutox recruits, whose natural armor plating could probably deflect small arms fire and whose claws could open standard military rations without breaking a sweat. The display was impressive in the way that natural disasters were impressive.
You couldn't help but admire the raw power while simultaneously calculating your odds of survival. And now, Groktar's voice took on the tone of someone about to reveal the punchline to a particularly dark joke. We have our volunteer from yesterday. The recruit who believes that attitude can substitute for actual capability. The human stepped forward without hesitation, though she had to climb the steps to reach the platform while the other species simply vaulted onto it. It was a small detail but one that emphasized the fundamental mismatch about to unfold. Observe class, Groktar announced, gesturing toward her with theatrical flourish, the pinnacle of human military evolution. No natural armor, no claws, no enhanced musculature, just soft flesh wrapped around delusions of adequacy. A few snickers rippled through the crowd, though notably not from the more experienced species. The Zenthari remained silent, their compound eyes tracking the human's movements with professional interest. They'd learned long ago that overconfidence was a luxury predators couldn't afford. Perhaps, the human said mildly, we could discuss my inadequacies after the demonstration. I'd hate to spoil the surprise. Groktar's grin revealed far too many teeth. Oh, there won't be any surprises here, recruit. This is going to be as predictable as a glacial ice storm. He stepped onto the platform, the reinforced surface groaning slightly under his weight. Standard combat exercise. No weapons, hand-to-hand only. First to yield or achieve incapacitation wins. Rules regarding creative interpretation of hand-to-hand. The human asked, beginning what appeared to be stretching exercises that looked more appropriate for a yoga class than preparation for mortal combat. Whatever you need to tell yourself to sleep better in the medical bay, Groktar replied, cracking his knuckles with sounds like breaking rock. The energy barriers hummed to life around the platform, creating a translucent dome that would contain the violence and presumably prevent any stray body parts from traumatizing the spectators. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by that universal fascination with impending disaster that seemed to trans-species barriers. Combat positions, Groktar commanded. The drill sergeant settled into a stance that had probably been perfected during the conquest of several star systems. His forearms positioned themselves for maximum striking potential, his natural armor gleaming with the confidence of someone who'd never met a problem that couldn't be solved through the application of overwhelming force. The human, meanwhile, had adopted what could generously be called a fighting stance, if one squinted hard enough and had never actually seen proper combat training. She looked like she was preparing to discuss philosophy rather than engage in mortal combat. Any last word? Groktar inquired with mock courtesy. Just wondering if the medical facilities here are as impressive as the recruitment brochures claimed, she replied. Someone's definitely going to need them. The crowd leaned forward in anticipation. This was going to be educational, all right. A masterclass in the importance of knowing one's limitations. The only question was whether it would be over quickly enough to avoid permanent psychological scarring among the witnesses. Groktar's claws flexed as he prepared to deliver a lesson in humility that would be talked about in academy folklore for generations to come. After all, some lessons were best taught through practical demonstration.
The opening moments of combat unfolded exactly as every spectator had predicted, which is to say, with all the grace and subtlety of a controlled demolition. Groktar launched himself forward with the kind of devastating efficiency that had made Brutox warriors the stuff of nightmares across 3 sectors. His massive frame moving with surprising speed for something that probably weighed more than a small shuttle. The human did something unexpected. She wasn't there anymore. Instead of attempting the kind of heroic last stand that would have made for impressive funeral eulogies, she'd simply stepped aside with the casual ease of someone avoiding a puddle on the sidewalk. Groktar's charge carried him past where she'd been standing, his claws raking through empty air with enough force to decapitate most smaller species. Coward, he snarled, spinning around with the fluid grace that made Brutox warriors so terrifyingly effective in close combat. Stand and fight like a warrior. I thought this was a combat demonstration, not a dance recital, the human replied, circling the platform's perimeter with steps that seemed almost lazy compared to the sergeant's explosive movements. Though I appreciate the choreography, the crowd murmured with the kind of nervous energy that preceded either spectacular entertainment or spectacular tragedy. Several Zenthari had begun what appeared to be a betting pool, their clicking language rapid with excitement. Even they hadn't expected the small human to last more than a few seconds. But evasion was a time-honored survival strategy that transcended species barriers. Groktar's second attack was more calculated, using his superior reach and multiple limbs to cut off escape routes. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had earned him his stripes and kept him breathing through countless campaigns. The human would have to engage eventually. The platform had finite space, and he had all day to corner his prey. Except she didn't seem particularly concerned about being cornered. Instead, she did something that made several spectators question whether humans had some kind of death wish encoded in their DNA. As Groktar's massive frame bore down on her, all four arms extended in a web of destruction, she moved toward him, not away. She slipped inside his guard with movements that belonged more in a fluid dynamics textbook than a combat manual, her small frame somehow finding the geometric impossibility of space between his attacking limbs. For a moment, she was so close to the massive Brutox that she could probably count his individual armor scales. Then physics decided to get involved. The human's elbow found a nerve cluster just below Groktar's natural armor plating, a spot that most species didn't even know existed on Brutox anatomy, but which human combat manuals had catalogued with the thoroughness of obsessive accountant. The sergeant's left arm went numb with the kind of sudden, complete numbness that made warriors question their life choices. "Impossible," he growled, but his voice carried the first note of uncertainty. Brutox nerve clusters were military secrets, the kind of information that required security clearances and careful study of xenobiology texts that most species couldn't even pronounce correctly. "Improbable," the human corrected, dancing away from his retaliatory strike with the same casual ease. Humans have this peculiar habit of studying things obsessively. It's almost like we enjoy homework. The next few minutes played out like a masterclass in applied physics and creative problem-solving. Where Groktar relied on overwhelming force and proven tactics, the human seemed to be conducting some kind of bizarre experiment in combat engineering. She used the platform's energy barriers as a backboard, redirecting the sergeant's own momentum against him. She exploited leverage principles that turned his superior mass into a liability rather than an advantage. Most unsettling of all, she appeared to be enjoying herself. "This is fascinating," she commented during a brief lull while Groktar recalibrated his approach for the fourth time. "Your species' combat doctrine is beautifully efficient, very straightforward, predictable, even." Predictable. The word came out as more of a roar than a question. "Pattern recognition is another one of those human quirks," she explained, effortlessly avoiding another devastating combination that should have turned her into something resembling abstract art. "We see patterns everywhere. Sometimes we see them where they don't exist, which leads to conspiracy theories and bad investment decisions. But sometimes," she demonstrated sometimes by exploiting a gap in Groktar's defense that existed for exactly 0.3 seconds during his standard attack sequence. Her small fist found another nerve cluster, this one controlling his right arm's fine motor control. "Sometimes we see patterns that actually matter." The crowd had fallen silent except for the increasingly frantic clicking of Zenthuri making and revising their bet. This wasn't going according to anyone's script. Combat was supposed to be about strength and speed and natural weapons. It wasn't supposed to involve geometry lessons and nerve anatomy. Groktar, now fighting with effectively two functional arms, made the tactical decision that any experienced warrior would make when faced with an opponent who refused to follow conventional combat rules. He decided to end this quickly through the application of overwhelming force applied in a very small area. He lunged forward in a devastating tackle that should have compressed the human into something more portable. She stepped slightly to the left. Groktar's momentum, unimpeded by the target he'd been aiming for, carried him directly into one of the platform's support pillars, with the kind of impact that registered on seismic sensors 3 levels down. The reinforced structure held, being designed to withstand considerably more abuse than even angry Brutox warriors could deliver. Groktar's consciousness, however, proved less resilient. As the 9-foot tower of armored intimidation slowly toppled like a felled tree, the human caught him with a display of surprising strength, easing his descent to prevent any additional head trauma. It was a considerate gesture that somehow made the entire situation even more surreal. "Medical team to training ground Alpha," she called out calmly, checking his pulse with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd clearly studied more than just nerve clusters. Non-critical unconsciousness, probable concussion, possible bruised ego. The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded either spontaneous applause or mass existential crisis. The assembled recruits stared at the scene before them, an unconscious drill sergeant being treated for his injuries by the same small human who'd just systematically dismantled everything they thought they knew about combat effectiveness. "Class dismissed, I assume," the human asked the crowd, her tone suggesting this was just another day at the office rather than a complete inversion of the natural order. Several species nodded mutely. A few of the Zentheri were still clicking, though now it sounded more like nervous laughter than betting calculation. As the medical team arrived with equipment designed to handle Brutox physiology, the humans stepped back to give them working room, brushing imaginary dust off her uniform with the same casual attention someone might give to straightening their appearance after a particularly vigorous handshake. "Fascinating species, humans," one of the Zentheri observers commented to his companion as they watched the medics work. "Small, fragile, completely unsuited for combat by any reasonable standard." "And yet," his companion replied, mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "And yet," the first agreed, watching as the medical team prepared to transport their patient to more comprehensive facilities. The human, meanwhile, had found a quiet corner of the platform where she began what appeared to be a post-exercise, stretching routine, as if systematic combat demolition was just another form of cardio workout that required proper cool-down procedure. The Nexus Prime Medical Facility had been designed with the admirable foresight of architects who understood that training warriors from 17 different species would inevitably result in a steady stream of creative injury. The main treatment bay could accommodate everything from Zentheri mandible fractures to Glacian thermal shock, with specialized equipment that represented the cutting edge of interspecies medicine. What it had not been designed for was the psychological trauma of watching a 9-foot Brutox drill sergeant being wheeled in on a hover gurney by a team of medics who kept stealing glances at the small human walking alongside them. Iventul, the facility's chief medical officer, possessed the kind of professional composure that came from 3 decades of treating combat injuries that defied both medical textbooks and common sense. A Venturi with the distinctive 6-armed configuration of her species, she could perform surgery, monitor vital signs, update medical records, scratch behind her ear, adjust the lighting, and drink coffee simultaneously, a skill set that made her invaluable in emergency situations. Today, however, even her legendary multitasking abilities were being tested by the sheer absurdity of the situation. "Let me understand this correctly," she said, reviewing the preliminary scans while her patient remained blissfully unconscious on the examination table. Drill Sergeant Gruktar, veteran of the Zephyrian campaign, survivor of hand-to-hand combat with 3 different apex predator species, recipient of the Galactic Defense Coalition's highest combat honors, was defeated by— She gestured with 2 of her arms toward the human, who was sitting quietly in a corner chair that had clearly been designed for much larger occupants. "Physics, mostly," the human replied helpfully, with some applied xenobiology and a basic understanding of leverage principles. "Nothing fancy." Dr. Iventul's compound eyes performed the medical equivalent of a double take. "Nothing fancy," she repeated, as if testing the words for hidden meaning. "Well, I did have to memorize the nerve cluster locations for about 43 different species," the human admitted. "But the Academy Library has excellent resources, very thorough anatomical databases." The medical team exchanged glances that conveyed the kind of professional bewilderment usually reserved for cases involving impossible physics or spontaneous generation of new organs. In the corner, Gruktar stirred slightly, producing a groan that sounded like a landslide having an existential crisis. "Sergeant," Iventul leaned over her patient with the practiced concern of someone who'd seen warriors wake up confused about everything from their own names to the fundamental nature of reality. "Can you tell me where you are?" "Medical bay," Gruktar mumbled, his voice carrying the clarity of someone speaking through several layers of therapeutic sedatives. "Hit by combat transport." "Not exactly," the doctor replied diplomatically. "You experienced what we might call an educational collision with basic physics principles." The sergeant's eyes focused slowly, tracking around the medical bay until they found the human, who waved cheerfully from her corner chair. The expression that crossed his scarred features suggested he was working through the implications of his current location versus his last clear memory. He attempted to sit up,
an effort that the medical restraints and his own battered nervous system discouraged with extreme prejudice. The demonstration was very educational, the human agreed. I learned quite a bit about Brutox combat techniques. Very impressive, by the way. If I'd tried to match you strength for strength, this conversation would be considerably one-sided. How? The word came out less like a question, and more like a philosophical plea for understanding. Humans have this peculiar evolutionary quirk, she explained with the patience of someone addressing a particularly slow student. When we couldn't outrun predators or outfight them or outclimb them, we got really good at outthinking them. It's a survival strategy based on the radical concept that the universe operates according to consistent physical laws that can be understood and exploited. Dr. Ivantal made notes with 3 of her hands while monitoring vital signs with the others, her professional fascination evident. Remarkable, your species developed intelligence as a primary survival mechanism, rather than a supplementary one. Among other things, the human confirmed. We also developed an unhealthy obsession with understanding how everything works, which leads to behavior like memorizing the anatomical weaknesses of species we've never met because, and I quote the study guide, you never know when this information might prove tactically relevant. Through the medical bay's transparent aluminum windows, the rest of the academy was experiencing its own form of revelation. Word of the morning's events had spread with the efficiency of a quantum communication network, carried by species who prided themselves on their warrior traditions and were now forced to reconsider what exactly constituted effective combat capability. In the mess hall, conversations had taken on the subdued tone of philosophers grappling with the collapse of fundamental assumptions. Zenthari warriors, whose entire culture revolved around physical prowess and natural weapons, were quietly discussing the implications of intelligence-based combat strategy. Brutox soldiers were reviewing their own training protocols, with the kind of intense scrutiny usually reserved for evidence of heresy. The most unsettling development was occurring in the Academy Library, which had experienced an unprecedented surge in requests for human military history, anatomical databases, and something called asymmetric warfare doctrine, that apparently involved fighting opponents by refusing to fight them in any conventional sense. Back in the medical bay, Groktar was attempting to process his new reality with the methodical determination of someone whose worldview had been systematically disassembled and was now being rebuilt from first principles. The Academy training protocols, he said slowly, assume that combat effectiveness correlates with physical capability, generally a safe assumption, the human agreed, works great for most species. Humans are just statistically anomalous. Anomalous, he repeated, testing the word like it might explode. We're the species equivalent of that one student who solves math problems using methods that technically work but horrify the professor, she explained. Effective, but not particularly elegant. Dr. Ivantal finished her examinations and began updating medical records with the kind of documentation that would probably be referenced in xenopsychology papers for decades to come. Sergeant, you're cleared for light duty in 72 hours. No permanent damage, though I suspect your ego will require more extensive rehabilitation. As the medical team began the process of preparing discharge papers and updating training protocols that would need significant revision, the human stood up from her corner chair and stretched with the casual satisfaction of someone who'd completed a moderately challenging workout. Well, she said to no one in particular, I should probably report to whoever's handling orientation scheduling. I imagine there are some curriculum adjustments to discuss. She paused at the medical bay entrance, turning back toward the still stunned drill sergeant with the kind of polite concern one might show for a distant acquaintance recovering from minor surgery. For what it's worth, Sergeant, you're absolutely right about the importance of understanding your opponent's capabilities. The mistake was assuming you understood mine. As she disappeared into the corridor, leaving behind a medical bay full of contemplative medical professionals and one thoroughly educated Brutox warrior, Dr. Ivantal made a final note in her record. Recommendation for Academy administration, revise combat assessment protocols to account for species whose primary evolutionary advantage is the systematic exploitation of everyone else's overconfidence. She paused, considering her words, then added, also recommend reinforcing the training platform's support pillars. Current specifications appear inadequate for impacts involving unconscious drill sergeants. Outside, the twin sons of Nexus Prime continued their eternal dance across the sky, illuminating an academy where the fundamental assumptions about warfare, strength, and the nature of effective military training were being quietly but thoroughly revolutionized by a species whose greatest weapon was the radical notion that thinking harder might be more effective than hitting harder. It was, as the human had noted, a fascinating development in the evolution of military doctrine. Though perhaps evolution wasn't quite the right word for what had just occurred, revolution seemed more appropriate, especially considering where the revolution's architect had left her first opponent. After all, it's difficult to argue with results, particularly when those results are currently occupying a medical bay and questioning everything they thought they knew about the nature of combat effectiveness. The universe, it seemed, still had a few lessons to teach its more overconfident inhabitants.